Okay, today, session 5, we have an exciting session about the power of narrative, changing story, shaping a hopeful future, exploring how storytelling, media, and collective memory can inspire healing, justice, and social transformation. So Edward Said said, narrative is a power. The power is narrative. So we have an excellent panelists today. The first, Reverend Dr. Mark Uno, professor of University of Oregon, and he is also true Pure Land Buddhist priest, ordained priest. The second panelist is Dr. Caroline Medine. She is an All Shall Be Well professor of religion and director of African American Study. Also, she is the president of the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies. And third presenter, Reverend Dr. Grace Son, a professor of the One Institute of Graduate Study in Pennsylvania. So everybody know Grace is a wonderful MC. And final presenter is Dr. Jessie Lee. She's a research professor of Wongan University. Also, she's a liberal arts education project. So she's in charge of this university. So we try to limit within 10 minutes presentation. So we want to have a more dynamic question-answer discussion, particularly from young people. So yesterday, we have a wonderful future generation session, yesterday. So please, prepare your interesting question answer after the presentation. Okay, the first presenter, Dr. Uno, he's going to present self-transformation and the world transformation. Please welcome.
Introduction. What the sky is to birds and water is to fish, language is to human beings. More precisely, it is stories that animate our human lives and with which we make and transform our worlds. Yet unlike birds and fish who follow the currents of water and air, we human beings often fall into the trap of trying to control the world we live in through forming stories that often lead us into cul-de-sacs of our own making. How do we extricate ourselves out of these cul-de-sacs, dead-end stories, these mind prisons with which we entrap ourselves? Next section, counter story. In her work, Damaged Identities, Narrative Repair, Hilda Nelson presents the idea that when the larger social narrative is not working for an individual or group, then it's necessary to create a counter story that gives voice to and makes possible a more authentic life for the individual or group. She imagines a scenario in which nurses working in a hospital become frustrated that the care they believe patients need and which they can provide is not being recognized due to the fact that doctors and hospital administrators fail to recognize the value of their perspectives. The nurses begin to share their stories with one another, collaborate, and then form a collective voice that the doctors and administrators can no longer ignore. When the nurses' efforts achieve critical mass in quantity and intensity, the hospital finally begins to acknowledge the value of their perspectives, for which the compelling force is provided by vivid, transformational storytelling. In this scenario, the stories they tell are not only transformative for themselves and their work, but for the hospital as a whole, patients, doctors, staff, administrators. This is a story in which counter-story helps the nurses to resist and transform the master narrative which had previously been produced and governed only by doctors and administrators. As another instance, this time an actual historical case, Nelson offers the example of Japanese Americans who were illegally imprisoned in internment camps during World War II, and how they had to create their own counter stories to endure, survive, and overcome the circumstances of their internment, and just as significant, build lives for themselves after the war and their release. Skip a paragraph. In Nelson's example of the hospital nurses, the nurses first had to overcome their own sense of limited authority and agency, which had infiltrated their consciousness, as doctors and administrators had subtly or not so subtly told them their knowledge and status were inferior. Once nurses began to see through the gaslighting of the hospital authorities, they find the motivation to act. They become agents of their own change, banding together with a common cause so that the doctors and administrators can no longer ignore them. But there are cases where Nelson's framework of counterstory that her framework does not take into account. For example, sometimes we find ourselves alone or very small minority, and we're unable to gather the critical mass or momentum needed to effect change solely on the basis of efforts made on the horizontal plane of society and history. In such circumstances, one possibility is to turn inwards to gain access to a whole other dimension of empowerment, that of the depth dimension of spiritual or religious depth beyond words, beyond stories. One can easily think of the enormous power of self-transformation and social transformation that has found their impetus in a single individual going deep within to tap their spiritual depth to eventually bring about social and environmental change. We can see this in such figures as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Thich Nhat Hanh, and also the founder of Won Buddhism, So Tai-san. And it's been wonderful in this ICCGC CoNGO 2025 to learn more of the story of Won Buddhism, of So Tai-san, and his son, Song-san or Song-tai, who became the president of Wonkwang University. They did not have the support of a large institution. They did not begin with large government backing. No, they were just alone with no resources, but they had an infinite resource when they went within, and their tremendous awakening to the power of the empty circle that can hold the entire universe gave them the power to create this miracle of Wonkwang University, which is the only university in the world that has a full medical school, Western style and Eastern style, K-medicine. This great institution, in a very short period, was created by a single individual going deep, deep within. And then out of that, attracting the talents, the inspiration, the cooperation of so many other people who saw the brilliance, not just of their intellect, but of their heart and their spirit. I want to share a couple other stories. Next section, Yadav Paeng, the forest man. Yadav Paeng was living as a small child in an area of India, and he went onto an island near where he lived, and he had seen that the snakes that had been inhabiting the island died because there was drought, and they had died. And he didn't know what to do. He was horrified to see that hundreds of snakes had died due to excessive heat in the barren river island of Majuli. That's when he began to plant trees there to repopulate the barren island, vowing to plant one tree every day. He's carried out his promise for over 40 years, and today there are nearly 1,400 acres of newly forested land where not only snakes can live, but Bengal tigers, Indian rhinoceroses, deer, and rabbits. He says, we are all connected, human and non-human. The trees and grasses, the sun, the sky, and the moon. A member of the indigenous tribe of Assam in northeastern India, he has plumbed the depths of his own spirit to find the power to transform the world around him. He states, I'll plant till my last breath. To me, his story is reminiscent of the story of our very own Kekashan Basu, who we are so fortunate to have had with us here at the ICCGC last year and this year. I was deeply moved to hear her speak last year in the Church Center of the United Nations. She described how, as a young girl at the age of 7, she was horrified to see that a small bird had died with its stomach filled with plastic. Coming from her own deeply religious Hindu background, she was motivated to address the devastating effects of human ecological destruction. Since then, she has gone on to create the Green Hope Foundation, which has helped to provide water, medication, food to numerous communities around the world, to hundreds of thousands of people and the vast ecological networks they inhabit. Through her work, she has created networks of capability, providing education, infrastructure, and tools to young and old alike for the present and towards the future. I just want to share one more story with you, somebody that I was very fortunate to know. Again, the story of a young person. Because oftentimes when we're young, we can feel alone, that other people do not know our suffering. We're not sure which direction to go. But as we have already seen by the brilliant presentations by the young panelists from yesterday, that there is tremendous power when you tap your spiritual power within. And even if you find yourself alone and the adults around you don't seem to understand your hopes and fears and aspirations, you should know that you are the future. You should know that the world is your oyster, and that we here at ICCGC, we believe in you. So this is Emily's story. Like others mentioned here, she was struck at a young age by the social inequality and ecological destruction that she saw around her, and she determined to pursue her studies in a career that would address those social and environmental ills. As a college student in the United States, she lived in their sustainable agriculture house. She majored in English and received her certification as a secondary school teacher. She taught English as a second language to recent immigrants, many of them refugees from Somalia and countries from South America. She tutored Spanish-speaking inmates in the nearby town of Faribault. She received a fellowship to work with women and children in Honduras to provide them with education and tools for sustainable agriculture and livelihoods. And after graduation, she received a Fulbright fellowship to return to her work in South America. Even though she was only 20 years old when I had her as a student while teaching at Carleton College, I remember her poise, wisdom, and great compassion that would be rare even for someone much later in life. We kept in touch after she graduated, and eventually I left for the University of Oregon, where I teach now. But I saw her enter a PhD program in Latin American Studies at the University of California in San Diego, get married to a wonderful young man named Chris, and have her first child, a boy named Miles. She continued her work on behalf of others. She began to run marathons, and she became a finalist in the very first national poetry contest that she entered. But then suddenly, I received an urgent message from her husband that she was very, very sick. And I immediately flew down to San Diego to see her. And by that time, she was already nearing death, and she could hardly speak. But I grabbed her ankle and pushed at acupressure points, and suddenly she opened her eyes. And I could see that she could see me. It was one of the most amazing things I had ever seen. Her body had begun to shut down after battling cancer, but she was still here, and even though she could not really speak and could only open her eyes occasionally, and only then halfway, she was here filled with love and gentle grace. Her mother told me that when Emily was diagnosed with cancer, Emily was the one who comforted her, not the other way around. And she had to give birth to her daughter prematurely so that she could go back on chemotherapy. But the chemotherapy didn't work. And so finally, Chris called me and said, "Can you fly down?" And I immediately flew down. Nurses were streaming in and out. because they wanted to see her as she was moved from one section of the hospital to the next. When one of the nurses brought her newborn daughter, her mother and her husband placed the baby next to her bed and moved her hands to hold her. And one of the nurses said, "Look, the oxygen level in the baby just shot up to 100%. And then they said, "Look, Emily's heartbeat has relaxed and slowed to the gentle pace of a mother who knows." And in that moment, I knew that baby Eloise would never remember Emily. But Emily had given her everything that she would ever need: a mother's love, unconditional compassion. So even though she had recorded videos for her, written poetries and letters for her daughter, the beating heart of the universe had come through to embrace mother and daughter. And in that moment, I realized this is the miracle of life and death. Just as one was getting ready to depart, the other was coming in, and yet in that moment, they were completely one. Eventually, one of Emily's students came to see her and said to me later, "Emily appeared in my dream and said I had to leave because the pain was too great." She didn't know that Emily had said that to me, but Emily appeared in her dream to tell her. And Abby, her student, said to me, "Emily was not just a teacher for my English literature course in high school. She was my spiritual mentor." So even the most difficult, what seems to be such a loss, so much suffering, we know when we go deep within, we go beyond life and death. We tap the power of the story beyond story, of infinite love, great compassion. And that Emily's story continues through her children and her student. So even no matter how big or how small you think your life is, no small good goes to waste, and it will sprout seeds in your life and other lives forever and ever and ever. And that is the power of spirit. That is the power of ICCGC. And that is the power of so many stories that people have shared on the stage, but just as importantly, at dinner, at lunch, in fellowship, through song. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very powerful story. Thank you, thank you. The next is Dr. Caroline Marine. The topic is problem and future potential. Future potential power of storytelling for the peace building in our modernity. So she from the America. Now it's midnight, so I appreciate Caroline.
Thank you. I want to make sure everybody, can you hear me? Is it okay? When we fall into a world of story, we gather together. We suspend disbelief and pay attention, engage in deep listening, which composer Pauline Oliveros calls an interreligious practice, to the storyteller and to each other. We for a time may enter another rhythm and sound and decenter and displace our own presuppositions. My mentor, the late Robert Detweiler, argued that participation in the power of story from fiction to testimony can develop in us a condition of acceptance that lets us move through life without demanding that things be the way we want them to be. As a human being with others, I can suspend the need to make my private meaning the only meaning. This opened up, Detweiler argued, a form of sociability that makes possible an expansive understanding of myself through exposure to the possibility of difference. When we leave the enchanted story realm, perhaps we go back to our real worlds with what J.R.R. Tolkien called a baptized imagination, one that sees the world differently, that might carry a trace of nirvana or of the kingdom of God, that better equips us to hear and to understand ourselves in relationship to others. Story provides in our modern world a possibility for community and for peace building. Human beings, I think, are hungry for story. So I want to think about the place of storytelling in peace building and how that possibility seems to be in danger. I fear that the capabilities that storytelling builds, like deep listening, the articulation of our values through metaphor, engagement with others and our own symbolic worlds, the ability to be in the same place with those we think of as enemy, and the capacity for critical questioning of our ideologies are not well cultivated anymore. Story is used dangerously in our time, in nationalist narratives, for example, in which religious and national stories become frightening in a world led by strong men who are encouraging violence. Storytelling has been considered as extensively as a key element in peace building efforts. As John Paul Lederach, perhaps the leading voice in narrative and peacemaking, argues, participation in our own and in others' stories helps us to develop a moral imagination which involves, and I'm quoting, the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies, the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity, the fundamental belief in and the pursuit of the creative act, and the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar frontier landscape of violence. Story is under stress in modernity, which seems to be governed by what bell hooks recognized as interlocking systems of transnational Mrs. Hooks, imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, whose legitimating meta narratives distort traditional religious and national narratives for the sake of power. This allows atrocity perpetrators to use story to form collective identities that dehumanize targeted groups that they fear, and it allows them to permit collective self-defense or preemptive attack. And we as individuals seek out our own information and interpret information in ways that reinforce our existing views while ignoring any contradictory evidence. I mean, if you are on Facebook or any other social network platform, you know what I'm talking about. We use the web, as one scholar put it, as a kind of dopamine that makes us feel good. In the local and the global, such cultural and political tribalism around stories has us devouring each other instead of building compassion and community. It seems that we are creating minds of cruelty that can block out or create disdain for the stories of suffering others. We are, in America at least, fearful and therefore potentially cruel. We live in an atmosphere of ambient fear that captures and reconfigures our everyday consciousnesses. We become passive, waiting for the strongman leader to name what we should fear. We enjoy the bread and the circuses. In a recent Commonweal article, Father Antonio Spadaro expressed well how our president in America is a kind of poet of the pre-rational, acting on the collective imagination. Father Spadaro writes, if Trump's form is poetry, his content is myth. It is a messianic discourse that operates on the spoken word and ritualized sacredness. He builds total visions. Words like always, never, and total disaster are not just descriptive, they are dogmatic, functioning as media age liturgy. When fear is mobilized and directed in this way, we become devoid of compassion and of concern for human dignity, and we fail on moral grounds. We direct our attention at the one we think of as the cause of our condition. And in America right now, there are many, but one, of course, is the immigrant. And this is especially true when we articulate and participate in stories that pit good against evil, in which corrosive elements like resentment or desire for revenge or hatred, but also love with a desire to protect our home or others that live around us, a way of life, focus on those that we name as the enemy. For example, we name the immigrant. Doing this, we lose a capacity to care for the other. And even when we feel empathy, as Paul Slovak suggests, particularly when we witness suffering in media, we are not really moved to put our stories in relationship to other stories. Indeed, empathy, which really can be just an emotion, is not like compassion, karuna, and love, caritas, which rightly lived move us into active practices through which we direct our emotions toward developing ethical works, learn to respond quickly and appropriately to signs of suffering. We come in practice, I hope, to be able to tell our own stories and live our own stories in relationship to the stories of others. We acknowledge that interdependence, that is, Martin Buber argued, presence, direct meeting that is not mitigated by a system of ideas or foreknowledge or fancy, a meeting in which definitions and systems collapse in presence, which constitutes for him all real living. Story brings us into presence, into a present moment, focusing and binding us. Carl Avenari suggests that the sticky, durable story, which he calls it, is a force that has kept us alive. Engaging story together, even watching a movie together, synchronizes our brains, potentially leading us to create new narratives out of our engagement with symbols, narratives to imagine viable, sustainable futures. This is not easy. We in the modern negotiate difference all the time. And we encounter in the face of the other, and sometimes I think in our own faces, both commonality and radical dissymmetry. Turning to, rather away from the other is difficult, but taking the risk to engage the other can facilitate a movement toward each other, opening what Levinas called an overture. And I love that word. It's like the beginning of a symphony that might lead us toward a beautiful hospitality. In this opening, perhaps we can acknowledge as valid and useful the stories of other people, and recognizing that we are all pilgrims on this earth. We, as we tell our stories to those we meet, could become at least allies and maybe friends. The acknowledgement of our common humanity leading us to try to create a counter-poetics or to create counter-narratives to those of destruction could bind us together in solidarity for coalition building, for sustainable living for all. In story, perhaps, even when we cannot always agree on all the details, we can come to agree on the significance of what is at stake right here, right now, and imagine together the work that we must do within this common mortal life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for finishing exactly 10 minutes. Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. Okay, next presentation is Dr. Grace Song. Her topic is From a Vision to Reality, the women's study, women's story with struggle for gender equality. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Won Buddhism was born from a vision that dared to challenge entrenched social norms. Its founder, Sotaesan, named gender equality as a core principle of the new religious order, a striking declaration in the early 20th century Korea. Yet the lived experiences of women in Won Buddhism reveal a more complex reality. Patriarchal customs, cultural legacies, and institutional inertia have often stood in the way of fully realizing Sotaesan's vision. This is why women's voices matter, not as side notes in history, but as essential correctives. Their stories reveal the gap between principle and practice and carry the spiritual insight needed for transformation. In this light, storytelling is more than remembrance. It's an act of reimagining and making that vision a lived reality. So my presentation examines the very tension between doctrinal ideal and lived reality, and shows how the woman's stories bridges the two. And so these stories preserve the real history of one Buddhist woman, their struggles, strategies, and their resilience. So I remember visiting Korea as a child. My parents would bring my sister and me every summer, and it was there that I'd always complain to my dad. I'm like, why don't you keep taking us to Disney World? He's like, nope, we are going to a one Buddhist training. Yay. So at that time, that was when I met many of the Kyomunims, right? And especially the women, the women I still met, wearing the clergy habit, the Korean dress with the crisp white top, the long black skirt with their hair neatly pulled back to a low bun. They were never in the background. To me as a young child, they never seemed to be in the background. They were always stood up front, speaking with these powerful voices, greeting others and just having this warm embrace. So as a young girl, what stayed with me was that confidence, their kindness, and the respect they commanded from the people around them. So on one trip, we visited Yongsan University, and I still remember this, and this is our seminary in Southwest Korea, and the president at that time was Venerable Chataon, and she invited our family to lunch, and I can still recall the sense of awe I felt. I wasn't focusing on her exact words, but I was watching the way she moved, the way she spoke, the effortless authority and presence she carried. And so from the early age, I understood something important, that women in Won Buddhism were not to be underestimated. And years later, I would understand why. And Sotaesan from the very beginning had addressed this gender inequality head on. In 1929, in Sayok Bogoso, he said, "Who else besides women is without basic rights and freedoms in this way? Women were not able to enact filial piety, no matter how much they respected their parents. They were discriminated against even by the children close to their hearts. Where else could there be such people without rights and freedoms?" So for Sotaesan, this was not simply a matter of individual injustice, it was a societal wound, an inefficiency that harmed everyone. And he compared it to a stone that could be lifted by 10 people being lifted only by 5. And he insisting that when half the population is excluded from full participation, the entire community, the entire nation suffers. So during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Korean women lived under a deeply entrenched Confucian patriarchal system that severely limited their rights, opportunities, and social mobility. Most were denied formal education, excluded from property ownership and inheritance, and bound to rigid gender roles defined by the 3 obediences: to father before marriage, husband after marriage, and sons in widowhood. Within this context, Sotaesan's advocacy for equal rights for men and women in Won Buddhism was radical, challenging long-standing customs by insisting that women be granted the same rights, duties, and opportunities as men, and opening unprecedented paths for women to become spiritual leaders. And this principle became enshrined as one of Won Buddhism's 4 essentials, originally the equal rights for men and women. But Sotaesan's vision went beyond the statements of principle. He created structural reforms to embody it. So one of the most groundbreaking was the opening of the Kyomu path. This is the ordination. Kyomu were to be spiritual leaders, preachers, and they received the exact same training as men. So unlike in most religious traditions of the time, female clergy in Won Buddhism, first of all, they were not required to get married, and they could lead their own congregations, manage temples, and represent the order publicly. So this is when the stories come in. One female Kyomu later recounts in an interview, "I came to this community to learn reading and writing of the Korean language, and to open my eyes to what was possible for women. When I came to this community, Sotaesan gave me a Dharma name. I was so happy when I had my own name and identity. At that time, I did not even dare to even think about becoming a minister or attaining enlightenment. As I continued to live in this nurturing community, my dream grew and I wanted to become a living Buddha. So you can just imagine in Southwest rural Korea, many women, even men, were illiterate, and this enlightened person, teacher, tells you you can attain Buddhahood because you have the same original nature as the Buddha, same original nature as Sotaesan. This was groundbreaking. So another female disciple shares, now I realize why Sotaesan was so dedicated to educating women and enlightening the public on matters of equality. Equality will never become actualized without an enlightenment movement. Sotaesan channeled the strength of the community towards a new way of thinking about the relationship between men and women. While many women spoke glowingly of Sotaesan's gender equality movement and praised his unwavering commitment to this vision, some also acknowledged the challenges they faced from their male fellow practitioners. Despite their teacher's progressive stance, many men in the order, still deeply shaped by entrenched patriarchal values, remained reluctant to accept women as equal partners. So one female devotee recalls, many men in the order were upset with the recommendation of gender equality. They contended that women should not have full freedom. If women get freedom, these males said, women would ignore men and dominate over them. I see some male ordains, they're like, not me. The men in the order insisted that women must have limitations in their activities. Men and women in the order fought day after day in the beginning of our community life. So it's through these stories we get the backstory, the things that we don't really know about. And another female devotee adds, we had to struggle with our male counterparts' prejudice. They said women were born weak, inferior, and incapable of doing certain work. They laughed at us and discouraged us when we struggled with hand wagons with heavy loads. We even carried an A-frame, a jjigae, on our back, which was a typical men's tool. It was heavy and difficult, but I was determined to learn everything. Our commitment and determination were essential to our success. So while the One Buddha's canon promised full equality, as you see, the lived reality could be uneven. Women sometimes held leadership positions in name, but lacked the real decision-making authority. So this is why it's essential, again, to turn the stories of women in the community. It's here, and this is where I learned about this other side of One Buddhism, especially in the formative years. So for the women who joined One Buddhism at that time, gender equality was not a gift freely given. It was a hard-won achievement. And one pivotal, yet little known chapter, not many people may know this one, this was done through a study, it was a qualitative study. They interviewed many of the women in the early years. And in 1954, there was a hunger strike led by female kyomus, and it's known as the Soil Rain Event. And this landmark moment in the history of Won Buddhism not only advanced gender equality within the community, but also showcased the power of women's solidarity. So the Soil Rain event unfolded April 1954 during an annual conference at the Won Buddhist headquarters. You were just there this morning in Iksan. As ordained devotees from local temples, they gathered for this conference. The women leaders began conversations about recent incidents of inequality. And they soon called all the clergywomen to join a demonstration. Their call was met with unanimous support. So every ordained woman participated in this hunger strike. One disciple later recalled, when I arrived at headquarters for this conference, I listened to the senior women leaders and agreed to join the hunger strike. We did not eat at all for 2 days. The demonstration continued for 5 days, from April 27th to May 1st, 1954. Another participant recounted, during the hunger strike that came to be known as the Soil Rain event, something unusual happened. On the second day of our strike, it began to pour a heavy rain mixed with soil. I had never seen anything like it before. The rainwater collected in the large jar in front of the building was thick with soil, and the sky remained dark the entire day. We decided to call our demonstration the Soil Rain event. As a result of the event, many changes took place. I got it, yeah. One female devotee recalled, we experienced profound changes in our perspective. The event heightened our awareness of biases, both our own and those of our male counterparts. At the same time, many male leaders also began to acknowledge and reflect on their own patriarchal biases. 1 minute, right? So I'm just going to close then. So as I reflect on the histories and stories shared today, I return to that early memory of visiting Korea as a child, seeing the women kyomus standing at the front, their voices clear. At the time, I did not know the full history that had shaped them. I did not know about the debates they had endured, the heavy loads they had carried, both literal and figurative, or the collective action they had taken to defend their rightful place in community. What I saw then as confidence was in fact the fruit of decades of determination and solidarity. So the women I met were living embodiments of the founder's vision. So in One Buddhism, again, storytelling is one of the ways we carry this work forward. It is how we honor those who cleared the path before us and how we inspire those who will walk it after us. So one day, another young girl may look upon these women, as I once did, with admiration, curiosity, and the quiet certainty that she too belongs in the front, shaping the future of her community. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you for your very transparent, very self-critical, honest, sharing. I really appreciate. The final presenter, Dr. Lee, her topic is a collective memory of Korea in the past 100 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 제가 마지막 발표입니다. 그래서 자료를 좀 쉽게 보실 수 있는 자료를 좀 준비해 봤습니다. 그래서 그림처럼 생각하시고 사진전을 본다라고 생각하시면서 들어주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 이 한국인이 가지고 있는 집단 기억을 한번 훑어보면서 우리가 갈등에서 평화로 전환되어 가고 있다라는 말씀을 드리고 또 그 순간에 우리가 이 자리에 모여 있는 의미를 한번 되새겨 보고자 합니다. 네, 첫 번째 보여드릴 그림은요. 네, 지난 100년간의 이야기들 중에서도 바로 독립운동과 독립전쟁입니다. 네, 한국인이라고 하면 실은 독립운동이라고 하면 딱 떠오르는 그런 그림들이 있을 겁니다. 네, 만세 삼창이라고 하는 태극기를 들고 있는 장면이죠. 독립기념관에 있는 자료를 준비해 보았습니다. 이후에 대한민국에서 아주 가장 크게 기억이 되고 있을 만한 집단 기억이 있습니다. 바로 6.25 한국전쟁입니다. 6.25 전쟁이라고 했을 때 한국인이 머릿속에 떠오르는 장면들이 있을 겁니다. 한국인이라면 실은 이 그림 밑에 제가 텍스트를 달지 않아도 무슨 장면인지 알만한 것들이긴 한데요. 그 해외에서 오신 분들도 있기 때문에 텍스트를 붙여보았습니다. 피난민들이 피난을 가는 장면입니다. 그리고 시간이 조금 더 현재로 가까이 오고 있습니다. 1980년대에 일어난 민주화 운동입니다. 보시는 사진은 광주에서의 사진입니다. 그런데 이 사진을 보고 나서 이 장면을 이제 보시게 됩니다. 2000년대에 넘어와서 광장에 모여 있는 시민들의 모습입니다. 왼쪽에 있는 그림은 2002년 월드컵입니다. 아시안 월드컵입니다. 한국인이라고 하면 또한 2002년이라고만 말을 했을 때 벌써 떠오르는 그 장면들인 거죠. 그리고 그 오른쪽은 지금까지도 사람들이 모여 있는, 그리고 그 속에서 많은 이야기와 논쟁이 피어나는 서울에 있는 광화문 광장입니다. 저 광장에서의 이야기들만, 그 흐름만 살펴보아도 우리 한국인들이 가지고 있는 집단 기억의 변화가 느껴질 수 있습니다. 지금 이렇게 몇 개의 사진을 보여드리기는 했습니다만, 이전에 우리가 전쟁과 독립운동이라고 하는 그런 한반도에서의 커다란 갈등을 기억하는 방식은 주로 사진에 머물러 있었습니다. 그러나 그 또한 1980년대, 90년대를 지나면서 구소련의 붕괴로 인해서 많은 자료들이 개방이 되었다고 합니다. 그러면서 전쟁을 보게 되는 시각도 다양하게 바뀌어 갔다라는 것을 연구물들을 통해서도 확인할 수 있었습니다. 전쟁이라고 하는 상처와 적대시하던 감정만을 부추기던 사회적인 인식에서 개인의 이야기를 들여다보는 것으로 전환이 이루어지기도 합니다. 우리가 그간의 한반도에서, 우리 한국에서 일어난 갈등을 어떻게 기억하고 있는가도 한번 살펴보았습니다. 학술적으로가 아니라, 물론 학술적인 자료들을 참고하면서 관련된 여러분들께 보여드릴 수 있는 사진이라면 이미지가 무엇일까를 고민을 하면서 준비를 했습니다. 독립운동이라고 했을 때 독립전쟁이라고 하는 전쟁의 한 장면도 기억이 남을 것이고요. 또 한국전쟁을 통해서 수많은 이야기들이 책과 이야기, 영화를 통해서도 다시 재생산되고 있음을 알 수 있습니다. 최근에는 한강 작가의 작품도 드디어 세계에 열려졌죠. 우리의 민주화 과정이 보여지는 그런 방식이기도 합니다. 그렇다면 다시 독립운동 이후에는 그 갈등의 사태가 끝났다라고 표현을 할 수 있겠네요. 광복의 시점이 있고요. 그리고 전쟁이 있은 다음에 휴전이라는 시기가 있었습니다. 그 흐름들을 통해서 우리 한국인에게 남아있는, 지금 현재까지도 공유하고 있는 집단 기억을 어떻게 나타낼까라고 했을 때 바로 남과 북, 자와 우, 이렇게 갈라져 있는, 아직도 갈등이 남아있는 우리 한국을 떠올릴 수 있습니다. 전쟁이 휴전된 직후에는 그 전쟁의 기억을 적대시화한다라는 표현을 제가 아까 잠깐 했었는데요. 그 사회 재건을 위한 그런 캠페인이 주를 이루면서 그 전쟁이라고 하는 소재를 가져오고 있었습니다. 그 중에서 재건이라고 하면 사회적인 경제 부흥을 위한 새마을 운동도 빼놓을 수는 없습니다. 이후에 88 올림픽 기억나실 겁니다. 그리고 혹시 가운데 있는 그림을 한국 사람들은 보면 무슨 그림인지 금방 아는데 여기 오신 분들 중에는 저게 무슨 장면이지? 라고 궁금해하실 수 있습니다. 바로 아시아 금융사태 IMF 때입니다. 한국에서는 그 IMF 시절에 금모으기 운동을 했었습니다. 그 운동을 하면서 또 한국인으로서의 정체성을 강화하고 다시 또 만들어가는, 그러면서 희망이라고 하는 단어가 함께 다시 생겨나고 있었습니다. 그리고 2002년이라고 하면 제가 바로 한국인은 떠올릴 거라고 했던 월드컵이 있었던 거죠. 그때의 슬로건은 꿈은 이루어진다 였습니다. 이러한 과정들을 통해서 우리가 갈등의 상처를 어떻게 치유하고 회복하고 있는가라는 생각을 가지고 한번 보여드리기는 했는데요. 그 과정에서 종교의 역할 또한 빼놓을 수 없었습니다. 제가 논문을 찾아보다 보면 이 시기에 한국전쟁과 종교, 기독교와 전쟁, 독립운동과 종교, 이런 식의 연구물도 꽤 볼 수 있었습니다. 지금 보시는 왼쪽의 사진은 그 우리 대한민국 천안에 있는 독립기념관에 있는 사진입니다. 독립기념관에서 독립운동과 종교의 관계, 그 당시 장면을 보여주는 기록물들을 전시하는 장면입니다. 그리고 오른쪽은 명동 성당입니다. 우리 한국인에게는 이제 민주화 운동이라고 했을 때 민주화 운동과 종교라고 하면 제일 먼저 떠오르는 공간이 바로 명동 성당과 조계종 사찰입니다. 네. 이렇게 제가 굳이 다 일일이 몇 가지 근거들을 논리적으로 설명하지 않더라도 종교의 역할 또한 컸었다라는 것을 알 수 있습니다. 그런데 이 와중에도요, 또 재미있고 아주 특이한 것이 있어서 하나 보여드리고 싶었습니다. 우리가 이 갈등의 사태와 그것을 해결해가는 이 과정, 그리고 그 과정을 통해서 집단 기억이 형성이 되어 왔는데요. 지금은 그 갈등의 상처였던 것들을 어떻게 기억하고 있는가라는 걸 좀 찾아보다가 안보 관광이라고 하는 관광이 있었습니다. 대한민국 국민이라면 땅굴이라고 하는 북한이 파놓은 땅굴에도 가봐야 했었고요. 임진각에도 가볼 수 있고 여러 관광지, 그걸 안보 관광지라고 하는데요. 요즘은 이 관광을요, 관광의 내용을 바꾸어서 그리고 관광의 목적을 바꾸어서 평화 생태 투어가 이루어지고 있습니다. 전쟁의 상처를 평화와 생태의 관광으로까지 승화시킨 그런 것이기 때문에 보여드리고 싶었습니다. 그리고 한국에는 그 유네스코 국제기록유산센터가 있습니다. 이곳에서 가까운 청주에 있는데요. 우리의 기억들을 세계적으로는 어떻게 기억이 되고 있을까가 궁금해서 한번 찾아보게 됐습니다. 우리 한국의 이야기가 기록이 된 것은 모두 20건인데요. 그 중에서도 갈등이라고 하는 것과 관련된 기록물은 4건, 평화와 관련된 기록은 3건, 그리고 종교라는 키워드로도 한번 찾아보았습니다. 그랬더니 2건이 있었습니다. 그 중에서 제가 전쟁과 갈등과 같은 주제를 다룬 기록물들을 한번 뽑아서 제목을 지금 보여드리고 있습니다. 근데 그 중에서도 바로 이상가족 찾기라고 하는 생방송 그 TV 프로그램이 등재가 되어 있었습니다. 그래서 이 장면을 보면서 저는 이렇게 치유가 되고 있었구나 라는 걸 생각을 했습니다. 이상가족의 아픔을 전쟁이라고 하는 거시적이었고 집단적이었던 것들을 개인사로 가지고 와서 그 개인사를 치유하는 과정, 이것이 전 국민에게 생방송으로 중계되었다라는 것이 가지는 의미를 알게 되었습니다. 우리가 2000년대 이전에는 우리가 우리의 한반도에서의 갈등의 사태를 기억하는 방식이 개인의 정체성에서부터 국가의 정체성까지가 정해져 있는 하나의 전체성으로 움직여야 했습니다. 그리고 그 안에서 안도감을 느끼거나 존재감을 확인하거나 그리고 사회적인 연대감도 확인할 수 있는 구조였습니다. 그런데 2000년이 지나고 2020년이 지나고 지금의 시대에는 제가 지금까지 보여드렸던 그런 기록물이 아니라 우리가 지금 이 사회에서 소통하고 있고 기억을 형성하고 있고 재생산하고 있는 방식은 바로 미디어이고 그중에서도 온라인을 통한 소셜 네트워크를 이용한 SNS와 같은 다양한 방식들이 생겨나고 있습니다. 이러한 방식들을 통해서 개인의 이야기가 수집이 되고 혹은 나와 비슷한 관심을 보이는 사람들 간의 커뮤니티가 형성이 되고 이렇게 저렇게 정보가 공유되고 있는 시기입니다. 이전에는 우리의 집단 기억을 생산해내는 쪽과 소비하는 쪽에 단방향이었다면 지금은 생산하고자 하는 이들과 그 기억을 공유하는 이가 또다시 생산을 해서 나누고 그 나누는 것이 계속 순환되는 구조를 가지고 있습니다. 이러한 시대에 살면서 한 사람의 정체성은 한 사람의 이야기로만 끝나는 것이 아니라 집단에서의 정체성으로만 끝나는 것이 아닙니다. 다양한 의식의 차원을 가지고 구성되어져 감을 생각해 볼 수 있습니다. 그러한 시기가 된 지금의 우리 오늘 이 자리는 ICCGC에 모인 여러분들은 이 개인의 정체성과 집단의 정체성 그리고 전 세계의 정체성을 함께 논의하고자 하는 자리이기 때문에 작은 의식이 아니라 더 커다란, 내가 지금까지 알고 있었던 것보다 더 커다란 의식을 향해서 나아가고 있는 분들로 보입니다. 그렇다면 그 더 커다란 의식이라는 것이 지구에서의 가능성, 그리고 지속 가능성, 인류의 지속 가능성, 인류의 공존을 이야기하고 있는 이 핵심에 바로 개인의 또 영성과 연결이 되어진다면 개인의 영성의 수준과 커다란 의식의 수준이 하나가 되어져야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 그랬을 때 갈등을 넘어서 평화의 존재로 나아갈 수 있다는 메시지를 드리면서 이러한 자리에 함께하고 계시는 여러분들께 저는 박수를 전해드리고 싶습니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So wonderful multi-dimension of the collective memory. Thank you so much. Now we have 20 minutes open for the floor, particularly young generation, So Socrates say, unexamined life is not worth to live. So having question is a wonderful life of the inquiry. So please, if you have a question, stand up, say your name and your institution or some university name or something like this, okay? Okay, open. You don't have to hurry, yeah. Take time. Yeah, you have a question? No. Do you have a question? You raise your hands. No. Of course, everybody are allowed to ask a question. Not only young people. Okay. Entire generation. Okay. Say your name and the institution.
I'm John Graysell.
Institution.
Can you hear? Yeah. Okay. I want to tell you just what happens when we have two stories that conflict. This is a true story. When I was the Baha'i chair at the University of Maryland, one of my colleagues was Dr. Kaufman, who, together with he and a group of Palestinian professors, were really trying to create peace. So they came up with but the Israelis and the Palestinians have two very different stories. So they came up with the idea that they would create a book, and the Palestinians would write down on one side the story, and the Israelis would write the others, and then they would try to, in the middle was an empty column, they would try to see how they could negotiate them. They could not do it. The most progressive, tolerant, intellect, they could not reconcile the story. So they decided to turn it into a children's book and ask the children, who actually did it better than but they still couldn't do it. What do we do when we have to reconcile two stories that are leading to conflict and try to put them together to one that will lead to peace?
So that's a great question. What do we do when we have two conflict stories? So in one way or another, I think all of our presentations touch on the fact that you have to go deep into a story to connect both with self and other, right? So, there's a Native American saying, you have to walk a mile in another person's moccasins to understand them. And so you have to be able to create a space where you can listen to and deeply hear the other person's story to begin to bridge that gap, right? So in terms of my presentation, you can't bridge that gap as long as you stay on the horizontal plane of my version versus your version. You have to go deep enough into letting go of your story so that you can let the other person's story in. And I think one of the great things about ICCGC, and which is really powered by the Won Buddhists, is it brings us into that deeper space where difference begins to dissolve. And so we naturally are open to listening to other people's stories, whether it's in a formal setting like this, or over a meal, or taking a walk. So there are therapists who work on a mindfulness-based dialogue. I have a colleague, Paula Young-Eisendroth, who innovated a couples therapy to do that. So that you have to reach a place where you let go of insisting my version. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. It reminds me, so we have a wonderful organization called Interfaith Philadelphia. And one of the programs that they run that I've been involved with for the last several years is called Visionary Women. And it's all the women from different faith traditions. We visit each other's places of worship. And in that space, you just totally surrender. It's like whatever their rules and regulations we follow. And it always starts with a ritual from that tradition. Then they have a panel where they explain their stories and their faith tradition. Then we ask questions. Then there's always a meal. And that really brings us together. And then we go into small groups where we're all different traditions. And so it's that connection of coming together, and it's the listening, the sharing, especially the ritual, and then being in that space as well. Being at the actual space, looking at the architecture, the interior, all of that, the art, all of the, even with the foods and the scriptures, all of that. Exposure is always important, and then being open to learning and also listening.
네, 저도 답을 드려야 되는군요. 그러한 그 기회가 문제가 생겼을 때에 바로 해결될 수 있는 단위의 문제도 있지만 접근 자체가 해결이 목적이 아닌 그런 문제가 있을 수도 있다고 생각을 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 우선적으로는 평소에 앞에 분들이 말씀하신 것처럼 서로의 빈자리를 만들고 빈 자리에 서로의 의견을 채울 수 있는, 서로 들어주는 시간. 저희가 그 가족 간의 갈등이 있을 때 하는 상담 요법 중에 하나가 아, 그래? 너는 그랬어? 라고 인정해주고 들어주는 방법이 있는데요. 그런 것처럼 서로의 의견을 교환하고 나눌 수 있어야 되는 시간이 미리 있어야 된다? 있으면 좋겠다라는 건 너무나도 제가 쉬운 답변일 것 같지만 말씀을 드리고, 두 번째는 그 갈등의 사태에 맞닥뜨렸을 때 저는 평화 혹은 우리가 목적을 되게 포괄적으로 잡는 경우가 있는데요. 우리가 이 자리에서 해결을 보고자 하는 것이 구체적으로 어떠한 범주 내에 무엇인지를 좁혀서 하나씩 내놓고 서로를 들어주는 것, 그 이야기를 들어보는 것과 같은 식의 조율을 한번 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 특히 정치적인 배경이 있는 이야기일 경우에는 누가 옳은지를 주장하고 싶어 하는데요. 저는 그럴 때 누가 옳은지를 이야기하기보다는 우리가 해답을 내고자 하는, 우리가 목적을 달성하고자 하는 해답이 무엇이 옳은지, 무엇이 더 가능성이 있는지, 무엇이 더 빠를 수 있는지, 무엇이 더 어떠할 수 있는지라고 하는 그 공동의 가치관의 목적의 먼저 합의를 보는 것이 필요하고, 그것에 따른 액션들을 조율을 해가는 것들을 연습할 필요가 있다고 생각을 합니다.
Thank you very much. Any other? Oh, yes. Please say your name and institution. Yes.
I'm Catherine Pothig, ICCGC. Yes. So Carolyn, I was so interested in your narrative on so many fronts, and you begin by talking about the danger that we don't tell stories anymore in certain ways. But for example, TikTok is full of sticky stories, right? In fact, they've captured the way to tell a short story very well. And I want to, and then I think what you were talking about in terms of Trump's capture, the mythological, the way that our consciousness are caught up with that. Maybe you could speak a little bit to the way stories are produced in these different medias now. Is your point that we have to be together, that old way of telling stories that we've lost? If it's lost, is there any other way that the power of story can become an innovative model for retelling?
I think about this a lot because my students are embedded in all kinds of stories, but they aren't peaceful people. And they don't seem to know how to be together with each other in generative ways. So I worry. I agree with you that TikTok and Facebook and all those things are producing narratives. I think they're sticky for a moment and then they lose their potency. Like one of my students was telling me the other day about people that they followed during COVID who seem to be telling really profound stories and they don't know where those people are anymore. I mean, they've disappeared off TikTok and all those other venues. But I guess what I'm more worried about is the kind of hyper part of the paper that I couldn't talk about is I think there's a level on which conservatives are right, that there's a hyper individualism that keeps us trapped in our own pleasurable story worlds that don't allow us necessarily to be able to talk across those pleasure worlds. And I find that really scary. Uh, in terms of I'm in America, so I'm looking at I'm looking at right now teaching an intro to African American Studies course in which I've got to say all kinds of forbidden words, right? Like slavery, like racism. Actually, I said intersectionality yesterday in my class on Friday. And I just think if language, I'm thinking also about the question about the inability to hear each other's stories. If certain things are forbidden, then we can never acknowledge the complexities. I guess that's what worries me when I talk to my students. They love stories, but they don't seem to bind them together. And I worry also about the ways that we translate the stories of the other for our own pleasure and not as ways of really Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois said we had to be very careful about the ways we use history for our own pleasure. And I think as I'm beginning to think a lot more about what it means to be a semi-privileged American and how the consumption of story does not necessarily make me a peaceful person or make our nation any more peaceful. And it doesn't seem to be helping us to be able to cross any kind of borders. It just means that we consume and we move on, and that's cannibalistic. And that's how I feel like, well, I'll tell another story and then I'll shut up. One of my students came in my office one time and there was a lot of negative stuff going on campus. And she said, I just realized we're not social activists. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, all we do is post something on our social media and we think we're social activists. And I thought, that's a pretty interesting, insight. So just to talk is not, and I'm talking right now, but the talk isn't to produce peace, right? It's not to produce compassion. It doesn't produce, it just produces uh capitalist consumption, creates a style, then it's over. That's the kind of stuff I'm worrying about right now in this moment in which I can say the wrong thing in next week and be gone.
Okay, thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. Okay. Some Japanese students, if you cannot ask some asking in Japanese, the Matsui sensei, you can summarize something.
Yeah,
If you have a question in Japanese,
Yeah.
Yeah.
日本語で質問
日本語で質問していいですよ。
日本語質問してこっちで通訳するから。
松井先生いらっしゃいますし。あ、手挙げた、手挙げた。
私は伊藤かなえと申します。今高校3年生で来年韓国の大学に行くことを一応控えております。
She's now the senior of high school students. She's planning to go to Korean university. University in Korea. It's a Kenkoku University. Yeah.
個人的な質問にはなってしまうんですが、先ほど問題を解決するには1対1で話し合うのが解決策だって先ほどおっしゃってて、ちょっと翻訳はあれだったんで難しかったんですけど、それについてお聞きしたくて。
In order to resolve the problem, the person-to-person communication, conversation is critical. So therefore, she wants to ask some question.
Further elaboration.
Further elaboration. Yes.
Can I?
Yeah.
So the question is, how can talking two people who have a difference or who can't resolve something, engaging in dialogue or conversation, how can they reach the resolution? それはね、お互いに耳を傾け、お互いの世界に入っていかないといけない。だからまず自分の心をもう少し静かにして、そして相手様のね、あの人はなぜそういうふうに思ってるんだろう。あの人はどういう経験があって、そういう悩みがあるんだろう。So, in deep listening, once we quiet our own mind, it allows us to imaginatively enter into the other person, to sense and feel that person, to open curiosity, to think, how come that person is troubled, or how come we got into this conflict, and what is their experience? What is the person behind the ideas that I don't agree with? And so quieting one's own mind, opening ourselves to the other person's world, and only when we do that, then the other person can begin to relax, and they're invited to do the same.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, you can coffee time, you can talk. Yeah, coffee time. So now the time has come. So now the coffee break. Please say thank you very much for wonderful. Now coffee break for 15 minutes. Okay.